General Hospital spoilers for Thursday, July 31st reveal that as the sun dipped beneath the horizon and the quiet of evening settled over Port Charles, Carly found herself alone in the Corinthos kitchen, staring at her untouched cup of tea, the weight of her thoughts nearly suffocating. When Jocelyn entered the room, sensing something heavy in the air, Carly didn't hesitate. There were moments when a mother had to confide in her daughter, not out of weakness, but because holding it in any longer would only allow the darkness to fester. Carly motioned for Joss to sit beside her, and after a long pause, she began speaking, not with anger or judgment, but with a kind of frightened clarity that only comes when someone you once trusted has become unfamiliar in the worst possible way. Carly's voice trembled as she spoke of Willow. She admitted that she had tried to convince herself the signs weren't real, that the change she saw in Willow could be chalked up to trauma, to heartbreak, to the chaos surrounding Drew's downfall. But now, after weeks of watching Willow grow increasingly distant, secretive, and emotionally erratic, Carly could no longer deny what her instincts were screaming. Something was deeply, disturbingly wrong. What happened after the wedding wasn't just the collapse of a romantic promise, it was the ignition of something far more destructive. The woman who once embodied serenity and resilience was now exhibiting signs of obsession, paranoia, and emotional detachment so chilling that Carly feared for more than just Willow's state of mind. She feared for the future of Wiley and Amelia. Jocelyn listened quietly, stunned by the depth of her mother's concern. Carly continued, recounting moments that once seemed benign but now felt sinister in hindsight. Willow standing too long at the window, staring out at nothing with vacant eyes, the late-night drives that no one could explain, the strange, clipped tone she had begun using even with her children, and the cold, calculated way she now spoke about Drew, as if he were nothing more than a variable to be erased. The Willow they knew was careful, empathetic, and protective, but now, there was a strange, sharp edge to everything she did. And it wasn't just Carly who noticed. Even Amelia had become unsettled, clinging tighter to Carly during visits, waking with nightmares, and retreating into silence when her mother entered the room. But perhaps the most alarming thing Carly had seen was Willow's growing fixation on Wiley, not in a nurturing way, but in a manner that felt increasingly controlling. Carly recounted how Willow recently insisted on pulling Wiley from after-school programs he loved without consulting anyone, including Michael. She had begun speaking of resetting the children's environment, limiting visits from the Quartermaines, and asserting that she was the only one who truly understood what they needed. Carly said it was as if Willow had rewritten the narrative of her own motherhood, casting herself as the sole guardian of truth and protection, while painting everyone else, Michael, Drew, even Carly herself, as threats to be managed or removed. The change wasn't just emotional, it was ideological. Willow was no longer seeking peace. She was seeking control. Jocelyn, struggling to reconcile the Willow she had admired with this new version, asked softly whether Carly thought this darkness could have always been there. Carly hesitated before answering. Maybe it had always existed in fragments, she said, buried beneath the weight of expectations, softened by the image everyone projected onto her. But something about the failed wedding, the public unraveling of trust, the humiliation, the loss of her carefully maintained identity, had unlocked that hidden part of her. And now it was pouring out unchecked. Carly wasn't a stranger to emotional implosions. She had lived through her own. But this was different. This wasn't a meltdown. This was a redefinition. Worse still, Carly feared that this darkness was beginning to feed on itself. Willow, once so loved by the community, was isolating herself, cutting ties with the very people who might ground her. Drew had become a ghost in her narrative, the betrayal used as fuel rather than something to heal from. And Michael, caught between loyalty to his wife and confusion over her transformation, was growing increasingly passive, unsure whether to fight, withdraw, or hope it would all go back to normal. But Carly knew better. This wasn't a passing phase. This was a psychological rupture. And it was pulling Willow, and everyone around her, into its gravity. In the days following the wedding debacle, Willow had quietly begun revisiting old documents, medical files, and legal papers related to Wiley's custody, ostensibly to update emergency plans. But Carly suspected something deeper. There was talk of modifying visitation, of creating new boundaries, of changing schools. Willow wasn't simply reacting, she was planning. And Carly feared that, in her current mental state, those plans might lead to decisions that would destabilize the children's lives and leave permanent emotional scars. She had seen it before, parents who, in the name of protecting their children, became the very force that hurt them most. As Carly spoke, she revealed her deepest fear, that Amelia and Wiley were no longer safe in Willow's emotional orbit. Not in the traditional, physical sense, but in the more insidious way, being raised in an environment shaped by distrust, fear, and revisionist thinking. She feared that if this continued, they would grow up confused, anxious, and disconnected from the truth of their own history. And as much as Carly loved and respected Willow for the mother she had once been, she now questioned whether that woman still existed, or whether she had been buried beneath the ashes of everything that had gone wrong. Jocelyn, shaken, asked her mother what could be done. Carly's answer was sobering, she didn't know. She had tried speaking to Michael, but he was reluctant to confront the truth. She had reached out to Willow, but every attempt was met with platitudes and distance. And while Carly would never act recklessly, the thought had crossed her mind, if Willow continued down this path, custody battles might be inevitable. Not for control, but for the children's well-being. But even that felt like a minefield, one that could destroy what little family unity remained. The most haunting part, Carly admitted, was the silence. Willow wasn't lashing out or creating scenes. She was quiet, focused, intent. And that, Carly said, was what terrified her most. Because sometimes, the most dangerous people aren't the ones who scream, but the ones who stop speaking altogether, who retreat into plans and strategies, who believe they are the only ones left who know what's best. And that's what Willow was becoming, someone unreachable, unrecognizable, and yet still central to the lives of two innocent children. As the conversation drew to a close, Carly looked at Jocelyn with tearful eyes and said she would do whatever it took to protect Wiley and Amelia, even if it meant going to war with someone she once considered family. The tragedy, she said, wasn't just that Willow had changed. It was that no one knew how far that change might go, or what it might cost them all. It was late in the evening when Dante finally stepped into Anna's office, the weight of weeks, no, months, pressed behind his eyes like an invisible storm. The low hum of Port Charles had settled into its nightly rhythm, but within Dante, everything felt heightened, on the verge of spilling over. He had been holding back for far too long, carrying truths too heavy for silence, but tonight, something in him cracked open. As Anna looked up, she immediately saw it, not weakness, but vulnerability finally ready to breathe. In a rare moment of clarity between two seasoned professionals bound not just by duty but by mutual trust, Dante began to speak. And with that, a new story unfolded, one that hinted not only at his emotional turmoil but also at the silent tremors shaking the future of those closest to him. What Dante shared with Anna wasn't just personal, it was prophetic. He spoke about changes rippling through the fabric of the younger generation. The kind that didn't shout for attention but simmered quietly beneath the surface until they could no longer be ignored. He talked about Rocco, his son, whose behavior had shifted in recent months. Not outwardly alarming, but subtly distant. A boy once grounded and loyal now seemed haunted by something unspoken, retreating more and more into himself. Then there was Emma. The girl once known for her poise and composure, who was now emotionally tangled in a web of secrets and unresolved pain. And finally, there was Gio, a name that lingered in the air like smoke. A boy with a complicated lineage and an even more complex place in all of their lives. Together, these three formed an emotional triangle so delicate and volatile that Dante feared one misstep could unravel them all. As he spoke, Anna listened with stillness. Understanding that Dante wasn't just describing a familial issue, he was outlining the first signs of an impending emotional detonation. These weren't normal teenage anxieties. These were the byproducts of years of secrets, of fractured identities, of loyalties split between truth and protection. Rocco had recently uncovered a thread in his own family history, something tied to Lulu's disappearance and the unanswered questions that had hovered over his life since childhood. That thread led him to Emma, who herself had been struggling to define her identity outside of her parents' complicated legacies. Her connection to Gio, while once innocent and youthful, had deepened into something tangled, burdened by guilt, temptation, and the creeping suspicion that nothing in their world was as it seemed. Dante admitted to Anna that what troubled him most wasn't what he knew, but what he didn't. There were conversations happening behind closed doors, glances exchanged in school hallways, and a kind of emotional language shared between the three teens that no adult had been able to decode. It was as if they were bound by a secret pact, forged not in rebellion, but in desperation to understand where they came from, and who they were expected to become. He feared that in trying to protect them from the darkness of the past, the adults in their lives had inadvertently built a cage of silence, one that was now being rattled by their children with increasing force. And then there was Gio. The boy whose existence was a contradiction, part of one world, raised in another, carrying a truth he hadn't even fully uncovered himself. Dante had observed him closely, sensing something volatile beneath his charm, something unresolved. The way he looked at Emma, half longing, half regret, and the way he spoke to Rocco, always measured, as if guarding a line he was afraid to cross. Dante couldn't shake the feeling that Gio knew something crucial, that could explain the shifts in both Emma and Rocco. A secret, perhaps, tied to his origins, his loyalties, or something far deeper, buried in blood and betrayal. Anna, ever the strategist, didn't interrupt. She let Dante speak, understanding that his confession wasn't about finding immediate answers, but about voicing what others were too afraid to see. What they were dealing with wasn't a singular problem, it was a convergence of hidden truths, generational trauma, and emotional reckoning. And at the heart of it all were three young lives caught between love, legacy, and the shadows of their parents' unresolved pasts. Dante then revealed something that chilled Anna to the bone. Rocco had started writing a journal. Not a typical teenage diary, but something darker, more philosophical, filled with questions about loyalty, betrayal, identity, and morality. Dante had only seen fragments, but they were enough to show him that Rocco wasn't just struggling, he was questioning everything. Emma, too, had become uncharacteristically reckless in recent weeks. Skipping appointments, lashing out at her grandmother with unspoken anger, and most notably, disappearing for hours with Gio without explanation. When confronted, she offered half-truths. Her eyes clouded with sadness she refused to name. Gio, meanwhile, remained elusive, always polite, always smiling, but with a gaze that seemed to hide an entire history he had no intention of revealing. Anna took a breath, her own thoughts racing. This wasn't just a case of teenage rebellion. This was the beginning of a slow unearthing, of truths long buried, of decisions made in secret, and of emotional debts that had never been paid. She told Dante that the changes he observed were not coincidental, they were connected, part of a larger emotional ecosystem that had been disrupted. The children were now the mirror reflecting back all the unresolved darkness of their lineage. And if the adults didn't intervene, not with force, but with honesty, everything could fall apart. Dante nodded, understanding the gravity of what they faced. He hadn't come to Anna for comfort, he had come for strategy. They needed a plan, not to control the kids, but to guide them through what was coming. Because something was coming. He could feel it in his bones. Whether it was a revelation, a breakdown, or a betrayal, he didn't know. But he was sure of one thing, the world Rocco, Emma, and Gio had inherited was unstable, and unless someone spoke the truths that had been hidden for too long, the next explosion wouldn't be metaphorical, it would be emotional devastation. In the quiet that followed, Anna promised Dante that they would not let history repeat itself. But deep inside, even she wasn't sure if the truth, once unleashed, would set anyone free, or simply burn down what little trust still remained. What they were witnessing wasn't just a teenage crisis, it was the unraveling of an entire generation, built on secrets never meant to be kept, and pain never truly healed. And now, that reckoning was no longer on the horizon, it was already here. Willow once stood at the altar with Drew, full of hope, reciting vows that promised forever. But those words, spoken in trust, had turned to ash the moment Drew's betrayal came to light. What followed wasn't heartbreak, it was an awakening. The pain had stripped away her innocence and replaced it with something sharper. Resolve. Quietly but deliberately, Willow made a new vow, not of love, but of revenge. And that promise, though unspoken, now dictated every move she made. In the days after the failed wedding, Willow didn't lash out. She didn't fall apart. Instead, she withdrew into herself, calculated, focused, and cold. She began reclaiming control of her life, piece by piece. The first sign came when she severed Drew's access to their shared finances, citing the children's protection. The message was clear, she no longer saw him as a partner. Only as a threat. She slowly erased him from every part of her narrative, family events, school decisions, even day-to-day life with Wiley and Amelia. Willow's transformation sent ripples through Port Charles. Those closest to her, Carly, Nina, even Michael, sensed a shift. Willow wasn't healing, she was rearming. Her demeanor became icier, her decisions more strategic. She spent late nights meeting with attorneys, consulting on custody plans, redrawing the family structure around herself and the children. Every step was methodical. As if she were constructing a fortress in which Drew no longer had a place. Even Drew began to see it. The woman he once knew, the one who forgave, who gave second chances, was gone. In her place stood someone he no longer recognized. When he confronted her about the financial freeze, she didn't argue. She simply stated that she was doing what was best for her family. Not their family, her family. The line had been drawn. What terrified those around her was the silence. Willow wasn't explosive. She didn't seek drama. Her revenge came through control, distance, and detachment. She made no public accusations, filed no lawsuits, just clean, quiet moves that slowly dismantled Drew's position in her world. To some, she seemed cold. To others, powerful. But no one could deny that she had changed. Willow had once fought for peace, for unity, for forgiveness. But now, she was done giving chances. Her love had limits, and Drew had crossed them. Now, the vow she carried wasn't adorned in white lace and roses. It was written in silence, carved in pain, and fueled by the need to protect her children from a man she no longer trusted. Willow had vowed revenge, and she was keeping it. Jason had always been known for his composure, his silence, and his discipline. He rarely allowed emotion to cloud his judgment. But ever since he heard the first faint whisper that Britt might still be alive, something inside him had shifted. What started as a mere rumor, a misfiled medical report, a glimpse of a familiar silhouette at a remote airport, soon became a thread he couldn't stop pulling. He tried to ignore it, to tell himself it was nothing more than grief manifesting as hope. But deep down, he knew better. It wasn't just wishful thinking. Something didn't add up. And now, he needed the truth. He needed to know if Britt was alive. And if she was, why had she disappeared? Why had she left no trace? And most importantly, who was keeping her hidden? The deeper Jason dug, the more surreal and dangerous everything became. What once felt like a desperate emotional hunch quickly spiraled into a full-scale investigation into something far more sinister. This wasn't just a missing person case. This was a cover-up, deliberate, calculated, and terrifyingly precise. The further he followed the trail, the more Jason realized he was stepping into a world layered with false identities. Off-the-books hospitalizations, and shadowy organizations with global reach. Someone, or perhaps an entire network, was actively manipulating Britt's records. erasing key details while leaving behind just enough inconsistencies to suggest a sloppy yet intentional deception. And Jason, having lived in the shadows for so long, knew better than most how to recognize a cover-up when he saw one. Every piece of information he uncovered only led to more questions. Offshore financial transfers made in Britt's name months after her supposed death. Surveillance footage from a lab in Geneva showing a woman who moved like her, who looked away just before the camera caught her face. A locked wing in a private facility linked to experimental neurology research, one that shared ties with organizations Jason had battled before. This wasn't coincidence. It was a trail. And if Britt was part of it, it meant she hadn't left willingly. Someone had taken her, or used her, and was now burying the evidence. Desperate and unable to shake the urgency building inside him, Jason turned to the only person he trusted with a truth this dangerous, Anna. She had seen enough of the WSB's darkest projects to know when something wasn't right. When he laid out the fragments of data, photos, and reports, Anna didn't dismiss them. In fact, the more she read, the more her expression darkened. She recognized patterns, code names, institutions, treatment protocols, that she had come across only in the most classified missions. What Jason had stumbled onto wasn't just personal, it was political. Scientific. Weaponized. Jason didn't care how deep it went. All that mattered to him was Britt. The woman who had risked everything to stand beside him when no one else would. The woman who had faced death with strength, humor, and defiance. He owed her more than this silence. And if she was still alive, he would find her. Even if it meant going up against global biotech firms, rogue WSB factions, and anyone else who dared stand in his way. The emotional toll of the search was beginning to show, even on Jason's stoic exterior. He barely slept, skipped meals, and operated in relentless pursuit. Carly noticed it, and so did Sam. But neither could dissuade him. He had seen too much to stop now. And the closer he got, the more it became clear, this wasn't just about Britt anymore. It was about something bigger. Something that involved medical manipulation, identity erasure, and the possibility that Britt was being used for experiments. Maybe even modified in ways that echoed some of the WSB's most unethical black operations. Each clue unraveled another twisted thread. A research team suddenly disappearing after a breakthrough in neuroregenerative cloning. A nurse who died under suspicious circumstances after contacting Jason anonymously. A hidden patient listed only as Subject Theta 9, a code linked to a project buried deep in classified archives. The implication was chilling. What if Britt wasn't just being hidden? What if she had been altered, mentally, physically, neurologically? And if so, would she even recognize him when he found her? Jason didn't care what state she was in. One truth became more and more undeniable: this wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Emma had been holding something inside her for weeks, a slow-burning unease that refused to fade. At first, she tried to rationalize it, tell herself that she was simply overthinking, reading too much into glances and whispered words. But as the days passed, and as Jocelyn's behavior grew more erratic and withdrawn, Emma could no longer dismiss the gnawing suspicion tightening in her chest. And now, she knew she had to tell someone. She had to tell Gio. It wasn't easy for Emma to open up. She'd always carried herself with composure, the perfect daughter and student, the girl who smiled even when her world was quietly falling apart. But Gio was different. He had become her confidant in a way she hadn't expected, someone who could see through the performance and recognize the storm beneath. As they sat together in the quiet of the park, beneath the fading light of late afternoon, Emma finally spoke, not in anger, but in a voice colored with worry and fragile honesty. She told Gio about the things she'd noticed. How Jocelyn had been disappearing for hours without explanation, how she had recently snapped at Carly in a way that was completely uncharacteristic. And how, during one particularly tense moment at the hospital, Emma had accidentally overheard Jocelyn making a phone call in a hushed, almost panicked voice, referencing something that had been handled and swearing that no one could ever know. At the time, Emma had tried to forget it. But what troubled her more was what followed. Jocelyn's sudden interest in accessing restricted files, her increasingly tense attitude whenever the topic of Willow, Drew, or even Britt was brought up. And the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, as if haunted by something she couldn't shake. Emma confessed to Gio that she didn't want to believe anything bad about Jocelyn. They were practically family. But something didn't add up anymore. And now, Emma feared that Jocelyn might be involved in something far darker than anyone suspected, perhaps not out of malice, but desperation. And that made her more dangerous than ever. Gio listened in silence, his expression unreadable, but Emma could see in his eyes that he, too, had started to wonder. And now, with her confession, they both knew one thing for sure: the quiet beneath the surface was gone. Everything was beginning to unravel. And whatever Jocelyn was hiding, it was about to explode.